On a bitterly cold night in December 1776, as ice slabs crashed against the wooden hulls and the Delaware River groaned like a living thing, a defeated army prepared to do the unthinkable. They were cold, hungry, barefoot, and outnumbered. Their enlistments were about to expire. Many believed the revolution was already dead. Yet within hours, those same desperate men would march into history and alter the fate of a continent. At the center of it all stood a tall Virginian with a rigid posture and a face carved by responsibility, George Washington. He was not yet the father of a nation. He was a general on the brink of ruin. The year had begun with optimism. In 1775, colonial militias had clashed with British troops at Lexington and Concord. By July 1776, the colonies had declared independence. But declarations were words. Survival required victory. And in 1776, victory seemed to belong to the British Empire. That summer, the largest armada ever sent by Britain crossed the Atlantic. More than 400 ships carried 32,000 troops, British regulars and German auxiliaries known as Hessians, under General William Howe. Their target was New York City, the strategic jewel of the colonies. If Britain could seize New York and control the Hudson River, they could split the rebellious colonies in two. Washington knew this. He fortified Brooklyn Heights and Manhattan with inexperienced soldiers, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers. They lacked bayonets, uniforms, training, but they had conviction. In August 1776, the British struck on Long Island. The Battle of Brooklyn was a disaster for the Americans. Outflanked and overwhelmed, thousands of Continental soldiers were trapped with their backs to the East River. British ships waited to annihilate them at dawn. Then, something extraordinary happened. Under cover of a dense fog that rolled in mysteriously overnight, Washington organized a silent evacuation. Throughout the night, fishermen from Massachusetts and soldiers from Marblehead rowed boat after boat across the river. Cannon were moved, horses were ferried, thousands of men crossed without a single British detection. By morning, the fog lifted. The British looked upon empty fortifications. It was the first miracle of the Revolution. But miracles did not win wars. The British pushed Washington out of Manhattan, then across New Jersey. At Fort Washington, nearly 3,000 Americans were captured. Morale collapsed. Civilians refused to support a losing cause. Soldiers deserted daily. By December, the Continental Army had shrunk to fewer than 5,000 men. Many had no shoes. Bloody footprints stained the frozen ground. The revolution, barely 5 months old, was dying. Washington faced a choice: retreat further and risk dissolution, or strike boldly and gamble everything. Across the icy Delaware River in Trenton, New Jersey, sat 1,400 Hessian troops under Colonel Johann Rall. They were seasoned professionals, confident that the Americans were too broken to attack. Washington saw opportunity. On Christmas night, 1776, he ordered the crossing. The storm was brutal. Snow mixed with sleet. Ice floes smashed against boats. Soldiers struggled to keep powder dry. Some artillery pieces nearly sank. It took hours longer than planned. Many generals would have aborted the mission. Washington did not. At 3 a.m., the troops began their 9-mile march in darkness. 2 men froze to death on the road. Muskets malfunctioned in the wet cold. But as dawn broke on December 26th, they descended upon Trenton from 2 sides. The Hessians were stunned. Within an hour, nearly 900 were captured. American casualties were minimal. The victory at Trenton was small in scale, but massive in consequence. News spread like wildfire. The rebellion was alive. Days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating British forces in another daring maneuver. With these victories, he transformed despair into belief. But the war was far from over. In 1777, the British shifted strategy. General John Burgoyne led an army south from Canada, intending to seize the Hudson Valley and cut off New England. He expected support from Howe in the south. Coordination failed. American forces under General Horatio Gates and the fiery Benedict Arnold met Burgoyne at Saratoga. The battles of Saratoga in September and October 1777 were fierce. Forests filled with smoke, musket volleys echoed across fields. Arnold, reckless and courageous, charged into British lines despite orders. Burgoyne's supply lines crumbled. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men. It was the turning point. Across the Atlantic, France watched carefully. For years, French officials debated whether the American rebellion had a chance. Saratoga convinced them. In 1778, France formally allied with the United States, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global war. French ships, troops, and money poured in. Meanwhile, Washington endured another brutal winter at Valley Forge. Soldiers lacked food, clothing, shelter. Disease spread rapidly. Nearly 2,000 men died. Yet Valley Forge became a crucible of transformation. A Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, arrived to drill the troops. He introduced standardized training, discipline, and tactics. The ragged army became a professional. By spring 1778, the Continental Army was no longer a militia, it was a fighting force. The war shifted south in 1780. The British captured Charleston, then moved into the Carolinas. Brutal guerrilla warfare erupted. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harassed British supply lines. Nathanael Greene used strategic retreats to exhaust superior forces. But the decisive moment would come in Virginia. British General Charles Cornwallis established a fortified position at Yorktown in 1781. He expected naval support. Instead, fate intervened. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed from the Caribbean and defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake. The sea was closed. Washington and French General Rochambeau marched south in secret from New York, covering hundreds of miles. British commanders believed New York was the target. It was deception on a grand scale. By September 1781, 17,000 American and French troops surrounded Yorktown. Artillery bombardment began. Trenches crept closer. Redoubts were stormed in daring nighttime assaults, one led by Alexander Hamilton. Cornwallis held out for weeks, but cut off by land and sea, with supplies dwindling, he surrendered on October 19, 1781. Bands played as British soldiers marched out. Some accounts say they played "The World Turned Upside Down." In many ways, it had. The war would officially end with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Britain recognized American independence. The 13 colonies became the United States. But independence was only the beginning. The young nation faced crushing debt, internal division, and weak central governance under the Articles of Confederation. States quarreled. Economic chaos loomed. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. Instead, they drafted an entirely new constitution. In a sweltering room at the Pennsylvania State House, figures like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Washington debated the structure of government. How powerful should the executive be? How would representation work? How could tyranny be prevented? Compromise shaped the final document: a bicameral legislature, a presidency, a judiciary. Federalism balanced national and state power. When the Constitution was ratified in 1788, Washington was unanimously elected the first president. He took office in New York City in 1789, aware that his actions would set precedents for generations. He established a cabinet. He enforced federal law during the Whiskey Rebellion. He refused a third term, establishing the peaceful transfer of power. Yet the contradictions of the new nation were profound. Slavery persisted. Native American lands were seized. Political factions emerged rapidly. The revolution created liberty for many, but not for all. Still, the transformation was extraordinary. In less than a decade, 13 disparate colonies had defied the greatest empire on earth, survived near collapse, forged international alliances, and constructed a constitutional republic that would endure for centuries.
History rarely announces the moment when the world is about to change forever. It does not thunder from the heavens or carve warnings into stone. Instead, it moves quietly, through frozen rivers, dim candle-lit rooms, whispered arguments, and exhausted men who refuse to surrender. The American Revolution had survived its most fragile hour at Trenton and Yorktown. A nation had been born. But birth is not the same as survival, and the United States, fragile and uncertain, was about to discover that winning independence was only the beginning of a far more complicated struggle. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. 13 former colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, proud yet precarious. They had defeated the greatest empire in the world, but they were united mostly by memory and war, not by stable governance. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had almost no power. It could not levy taxes. It could not regulate trade effectively. It could not even compel states to cooperate. Soldiers who had fought bravely were unpaid. Inflation spiraled. Farmers lost land. In Massachusetts, anger erupted into open rebellion in 1786 when Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War veteran, led armed farmers against state courts that were seizing property. Shays' rebellion was small and quickly suppressed, but its message was unmistakable. The young republic was unstable. Leaders feared chaos. Some feared collapse. Others feared monarchy returning in disguise. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania State House, the same building where independence had been declared 11 years earlier. Officially, they were there to revise the Articles. In reality, they intended something far more radical. Among them were towering figures: James Madison, meticulous and intellectual; Alexander Hamilton, ambitious and sharp-tongued; Benjamin Franklin, elderly yet wise; and presiding over the convention, the man whose presence alone lent legitimacy, George Washington. The debates were intense and often secret. Windows were kept shut despite the summer heat to prevent eavesdropping. Delegates argued about representation. Large states wanted population-based power. Small states demanded equal voice. The result was the Great Compromise, a bicameral legislature, one house based on population, the other granting equal representation to states. They debated executive power. The revolution had been fought against a king. No one wanted another. Yet a weak executive could doom the nation. Eventually, they created a single president with defined powers, but checked by Congress and the courts. The most painful debates revolved around slavery. Southern states insisted on counting enslaved people for representation while denying them rights. The infamous 3/5 Compromise was born, a moral contradiction embedded in the nation's founding document. When the Constitution was completed in September 1787, it was not universally celebrated. Many feared it gave too much power to the federal government. Ratification required intense persuasion. Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay wrote essays defending the new framework, later known as the Federalist Papers. Gradually, state by state, the Constitution was ratified. In 1788, the United States had a new government. In 1789, Washington was unanimously elected president. His inauguration in New York City was modest compared to modern spectacles, yet its significance was immense. No republic of such scale had survived in modern history. Monarchies dominated the world. Skeptics predicted failure. Washington understood that every decision would set precedent. He formed a cabinet, appointing Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. Almost immediately, ideological fault lines emerged. Hamilton believed in a strong central government, a national bank, and an economy driven by commerce and industry. Jefferson championed agrarian democracy and states' rights. Their rivalry defined early American politics and gave birth to the first political parties. In 1791, Congress chartered the first Bank of the United States, a victory for Hamilton, but political tension deepened. Newspapers became partisan weapons. Accusations flew. The young republic discovered that freedom of speech included harsh criticism. Meanwhile, events abroad tested neutrality. The French Revolution erupted in 1789. At first, Americans cheered. France had aided their independence. But as the revolution turned violent, culminating in the Reign of Terror, opinions divided. Should America support revolutionary France or maintain distance? Washington chose neutrality, believing the nation too fragile for foreign entanglements. His farewell address in 1796 warned against permanent alliances and partisan bitterness, advice that would echo for centuries. When Washington stepped down after 2 terms, he reinforced a principle more powerful than any speech: peaceful transfer of power. John Adams succeeded him, followed by Thomas Jefferson in 2000, after a fiercely contested election. The peaceful transition between rival parties was extraordinary in a world accustomed to coups and crowns. Jefferson soon doubled the nation's size through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, acquiring vast territories from France. The Constitution did not explicitly authorize such a purchase, yet Jefferson seized the opportunity. Overnight, America stretched to the Mississippi River and beyond. Exploration followed. Lewis and Clark ventured west, mapping unknown lands, encountering Native American nations, and reaching the Pacific. The frontier became both promise and tragedy. Opportunity for settlers, displacement for indigenous peoples. By the early 20th century, the United States was growing rapidly, but tensions simmered beneath expansion. Britain still interfered with American trade and impressed sailors into its navy. In 1812, the United States declared war. The War of 1812 was chaotic and inconclusive. British troops burned Washington, D.C., including the White House. Yet American resilience stiffened. At the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson achieved a dramatic victory after peace negotiations had technically concluded. The war fostered nationalism. Industry expanded. Infrastructure improved. Yet the question of slavery grew heavier. As new territory sought statehood, the balance between free and slave states became explosive. The Missouri Compromise of 2020 temporarily maintained equilibrium, but compromise was becoming more fragile.
The 1830s and 1840s saw rapid territorial expansion. Texas annexed, war with Mexico fought, California gained. The phrase manifest destiny captured the belief that America was destined to span the continent. Railroads stretched westward, gold was discovered in California, immigrants poured in from Ireland and Germany. Yet every mile west intensified the slavery debate. In 1850, another compromise attempted to ease tensions, including a stricter Fugitive Slave Act that outraged abolitionists. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, stirred Northern conscience. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed territories to decide slavery by popular sovereignty. Violence erupted in Bleeding, Kansas. A new political party formed, the Republicans, opposed to slavery's expansion. Among their rising figures was a tall, self-taught lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln argued that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. When Lincoln was elected president without carrying a single Southern state, Southern leaders saw it as existential threat. One by one, states seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. A civil war began. It would become the deadliest conflict in American history. Battles like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Shiloh left fields soaked in blood. Brothers fought brothers. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Industrial warfare, railroads, telegraphs, and ironclads transformed combat. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in rebelling states free. It shifted the moral purpose of the war. The struggle was no longer only for union, but for human freedom. At Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered a brief yet immortal address, redefining the war as a test whether a nation conceived in liberty could endure.
History does not move in straight lines. It surges forward, stalls, fractures, rebuilds, and sometimes trembles at the edge of collapse. The United States, born from rebellion and shaped by compromise, entered the 20th century believing it had survived its greatest trials. It had endured civil war, stitched itself back together, and transformed into an industrial titan. But the decades ahead would test not only its strength, but its identity. When World War II ended in 1945, the United States stood as one of two global superpowers alongside the Soviet Union. Europe lay shattered, Asia burned with the scars of invasion and atomic fire. American factories had outproduced the world, its military had crossed oceans and liberated continents, its economy was intact, its confidence soared. Yet beneath victory lay anxiety. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union dissolved quickly into suspicion. Two ideologies faced each other across a divided Europe, democratic capitalism and communist authoritarianism. Winston Churchill called it an Iron Curtain. The Cold War had begun. The conflict was not fought directly between Washington and Moscow. Instead, it unfolded through proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and a terrifying arms race. Nuclear weapons multiplied. Each side developed hydrogen bombs capable of annihilating cities in seconds. In 1950, war erupted in Korea. North Korean forces, backed by the Soviets and later China, invaded South Korea. The United States intervened under United Nations authority. The Korean War became a brutal stalemate, ending in 1953 without clear victory. It set a precedent. America would contain communism wherever it expanded. At home, fear of communist infiltration sparked hysteria. Senator Joseph McCarthy accused government officials, artists, and intellectuals of subversion. Careers were destroyed, trust eroded. The nation wrestled with balancing security and liberty. Yet the 1950s were also years of growth. Suburbs expanded, highways stretched coast to coast, consumer culture flourished, television entered nearly every home. The American dream seemed attainable to millions, but not to all. In the South, segregation laws still enforced racial discrimination. African Americans who had fought for freedom abroad returned to a nation that denied them equal rights. In 1955, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest ignited a boycott led by a young pastor, Martin Luther King Jr. The civil rights movement gathered momentum. Sit-ins, marches, and peaceful protests challenged injustice. Television broadcast images of violence against demonstrators into living rooms across the country. The moral contradiction became impossible to ignore. In 1963, King delivered his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C., before hundreds of thousands. The following year, the Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act protected ballot access. The United States was changing. Yet even as it confronted injustice at home, it escalated war abroad. Vietnam became the central battleground of Cold War tension. What began as limited advisory support grew into full-scale military engagement. By the late 1960s, hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed. The war divided the nation. Protests erupted on college campuses. Televised combat brought graphic images into homes nightly. Trust in government eroded further after revelations that officials had misled the public about progress. In 1968 alone, the nation was shaken by assassinations, Martin Luther King Jr. in April and Senator Robert F. Kennedy in June. Cities burned. Faith in institutions faltered. Yet amid turmoil, extraordinary achievements unfolded. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy had declared that America would land a man on the moon before the decade's end. It was an audacious promise in the midst of Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. On July 20, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped on the lunar surface. He said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The moon landing symbolized technological mastery and human possibility. The 1970s brought further upheaval. The Watergate scandal exposed presidential misconduct. In 1974, President Nixon resigned, the only U.S. president to do so. The peaceful transfer of power once again demonstrated constitutional resilience, even amid disgrace. Economic stagnation and oil crises challenged prosperity. Confidence dipped, yet innovation persisted. Silicon Valley began emerging as a center of technological revolution. Microchips and personal computers hinted at a digital future. The 1980s marked renewed assertiveness in foreign policy. President Ronald Reagan adopted a hard line against the Soviet Union, increasing defense spending and labeling it an evil empire. Yet behind the rhetoric, diplomatic channels remained open. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Crowds climbed its concrete spine, dismantling a symbol of division brick by brick. 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended not with nuclear fire, but with political transformation. For the first time in decades, the United States stood as the sole global superpower. Many believed liberal democracy had triumphed permanently. The 1990s were marked by economic expansion and rapid technological growth. The internet connected millions. Globalization accelerated. American culture spread worldwide. Yet history does not pause for celebration. On September 11, 2001, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes. 2 struck the World Trade Center towers in New York City. 1 hit the Pentagon. Nearly 3,000 people died. The attacks stunned the nation. The illusion of invulnerability vanished. The United States launched wars in Afghanistan and later Iraq. The war on terror reshaped foreign policy for decades. Questions of security, surveillance, and civil liberties resurfaced in new forms. In 2008, a financial crisis triggered the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Housing markets collapsed, banks failed, millions lost jobs. Once again, the resilience of the American system was tested. Through it all, political polarization intensified. Media landscapes fragmented. Social media reshaped communication, amplifying voices and divisions alike. Yet American history has always been a story of tension between unity and division, idealism and reality, power and principle. The nation that began as 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic now spans 50 states and influences global affairs. Its constitution, drafted in secrecy during a hot Pennsylvania summer, remains one of the world's oldest governing charters still in operation. Its contradictions persist. Inequality, racial injustice, immigration debates, environmental challenges, and political discord shape modern discourse, but so does innovation. American universities lead research in medicine, technology, and science. Entrepreneurs launch companies that transform global communication and commerce. Cultural influence, from music to film, circles the planet. From the frozen crossing of the Delaware to the digital age, the American journey has never been simple. It is a story of survival against odds, of ideals tested in fire. It is a story of imperfect people attempting extraordinary experiments in self-government. At every turning point, the Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the Cold War, the War on Terror, the question has resurfaced: can this republic endure? The answer has never been automatic. It has required sacrifice, reform, vigilance, and renewal. When George Washington relinquished power rather than seize it, he established restraint as a foundation. When Abraham Lincoln preserved the Union while ending slavery, he expanded its moral promise. When civil rights activists marched peacefully into violence, they reshaped democracy itself. Each generation inherits not a finished masterpiece, but an unfinished project. The United States is not defined solely by victory or crisis, but by its capacity to adapt. Its constitution has been amended, its laws revised, its borders expanded, its understanding of liberty broadened. The American experiment continues because it has never claimed perfection, only possibility. In 1776, survival